Today we're going to talk about 3 different beginner mistakes that I see happen a lot inside PHP when they start learning PHP for the first time, whenever they want to handle user data from a form. Now these are mistakes that I made back when I was learning PHP for the first time, and these are also mistakes that I still see people make today. So it is a good idea just to talk about them so people they can find this video and just learn something from it and maybe get a little bit better when it comes to handling data from a user and just doing a better job when it comes to basic security. The first example we're going to talk about here is going to be about validation and sanitation of data. So whenever you have a form inside your website and you send that data to a separate PHP file in order for it to actually handle all that data, you want to make sure you validate and sanitize your data properly. Now, there is a difference between validating and sanitizing data. Validating basically means you go in and you actually check, is this the proper data type? And then you have sanitation that actually goes inside and sanitizes the data so it doesn't become dangerous to do anything with inside the website. So inside my code here, I do have an example of validating data, which is basically when we send over the data to another page like we did here, and then we grab the data and actually check, is this valid data? So in order to validate our data, we do have a couple of different functions we can use. We have filter_input and we have filter_var, which is going to go inside and actually check the data to make sure it is the proper data type. Or we can do other things like in this example here by going in and actually checking if this is a valid email. So if I were to, for example, use filter_var here, I can go in and if I were to write just filter inside the second parameter here, you can see we have many different things we can do using this particular function here. If I would say validate, you can also see we can check for many different types of data or, emails or domains or URLs and that kind of thing to just kind of check if this is the proper type of data that was actually submitted by the user. So if the user filled something incorrectly, we can then go down, do some code, or if not, then we can send them back with an error message to say, hey, you did not fill in the proper email, or you didn't format the email correctly or something. But now we do also have something called sanitation. So if I were to actually take this data here, we can actually sanitize the data. And the way we can do that is by using a function called HTML special characters or HTML entities. Now HTML special characters is the more typical one, but they do have slight differences. So if I were to go in here, we can actually grab the data, put it inside this function here, which basically convert all this data into HTML special characters. So for example, a ampersand is not going to be an actual ampersand anymore. So we're kind of converting the data into HTML special characters. And when we output it back inside the browser, then we convert it back again into what it's supposed to be. And this is going to sanitize the data so it's no longer dangerous for us to output inside our website. It is important to note here as well that whenever we do this, we usually don't do it when we insert data inside a database or just use data inside our code. This is more when it comes to actually outputting the data inside a website. So validation is for using inside our code and sanitation is for outputting inside our website. The second example here we're going to talk about is using depreciated functions when it comes to handling data and actually inserting it inside a database. Because something you may not know is that we actually have 3 different ways we can insert data inside a database. We can either use MySQL, we can use MySQL, or we can use PDO. But something people may not know is that one of these methods is actually depreciated. So you should no longer be using MySQL functions in order to actually handling database and submitting data to a database. Or just in general querying a database, any sort of interaction you have with a database, do not use MySQL functions. And this is my short example that I have on screen here because I do see some people go in and when they connect to a database, this is how you would do it using MySQL. So you have the actual database parameters and then you actually connect to the database. Then you go down, you sanitize the data using a real escape string or any other kind of function that might go in and sanitize data, for example, HTML special characters. And then you would go in and actually query the database again using MySQL functions. And this is not something you should be doing. It's also very important to point out here that a lot of people misunderstand what I say when I say do not use MySQL, or they go into my tutorials and say, hey, you're not supposed to use MySQL. There is a big difference between a MySQL database and MySQL PHP functions because these are 2 completely different things. MySQL databases are not a bad thing. They're not depreciated. They're not unsecure. But PHP MySQL functions are depreciated and should not be used because they are not secure. So therefore, you should always be using MySQL, which stands for improved functions inside your PHP code, or you should be using PDO in order to connect to a database and doing things with a database anytime you need to interact with it. And speaking about databases, let's talk a bit about using prepared statements and not using prepared statements, because some people do go inside their code and they just query the database directly without actually doing anything with prepared statements. This is something that I especially see a lot of people miss out on for the first time when they learn PHP, and this is why inside my course for beginners, I do not teach people how to connect to a database and query it without using prepared statements, because there's no need for you to not do it using prepared statements. So you need to make sure you do it every single time. So inside my code here, I have a basic PDO connection. So we go in and we connect to the database, and we can then refer to this connection here in order to actually connect to the database. Then we grab the user data, which in this case is going to be a username and a password. Again, this is submitted from a separate form, so we send it to this file here, and then we can do something with this data. For example, selecting a user from inside the database. So what you should then not be doing is going down and just saying we want to create a query string, and then simply go in and actually query the database directly. Because that is something you can do, but you should never do it. You should always go down, make sure that you create this query, which is correct. So you can still do that from up here as well. There's nothing wrong with that part. But this part here, we actually go in and query the database. You need to make sure that instead of just querying it, you actually go in, you create a prepared statement, which is going to send your query to the database separately from the data. So in that way, a user cannot go inside your website and inject some code inside the inputs and send it into your database directly. So instead, you separate it, send the query in first, and then you send in the user data afterward, which is going to separate these two operations, which is a good thing. So we send the query to the database after creating it, then we go down and then we bind the user data to the actual parameters to be set inside our query. So our username here and the password are going to be placeholders, and then we can just simply add a piece of data to those placeholders afterwards and then send the data to the database. And this is how you do that securely to avoid SQL injection. And that is all I had for you today when it comes to 3 different common mistakes that I see people make as a PHP beginner. Hopefully you learned something new if you did not do these already, since it is important that whenever we handle user data, we do so securely. So there's a lot of security in PHP, and it is very easy to miss something. So hopefully you learned something here. And with that said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.